Okay, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. This session today is on early literacy, and the title of it is Early Literacy Every Run Starts with a First Step. My name is Verna Chinen, and I am with the Hawaii Department of Education, Special Education Section. So when we first started with this in-person presentation, what we had our audience do, our participants do, was turn and talk with each other and engage in a conversation. So since you're viewing this on screen, what I'd like you to do instead is just kind of think back to a conversation that you had with somebody in which you shared a funny story or a silly happening, and just kind of relive that moment and what made you smile, and just pay attention to how that conversation went. So I'm going to give you about a minute to just kind of relive that moment, and then I'll come back in and start up again. Okay, so that was about a minute, a little bit less, and you can see that for some of you that might felt like, wow, that was really a long time. But what I want you to do is just kind of hold in your memory the idea of that conversation and just the back and forth that you had between yourself and your communication partner, because I'll be kind of asking you to reflect back on that as we go through this presentation. All right. But we are talking about literacy, and what's important to understand that literacy development evolves on a continuum, and all children begin as in the emergent literacy stage. And emergent literacy is that time of life in which the children are preparing to learn how to read and write. And when we talk about literacy, we're really talking about reading and writing skills. So the emergent literacy is just that time when language is developing and everything. And that is preparation to move on to learning to read. In the Western society, most children enter kindergarten, and they are then embarking on that academic path of learning to read. So typically in the Western societies, it starts at about kindergarten, 6 years old, 7 years old, 8 years old, where they're teaching the children how to read. Once the child learns how to read, now you typically hear educators talking about the child is now reading to learn. So if you think back to when you were when you were in grade school, this probably happened when you were in about the 4th or 5th grade, in which now you have those skills in reading, and now you are reading textbooks, you're reading novels, you're reading different things, and you're reading to get different information. You're learning about science, social studies, different things. And then once you get up to high school, you're reading in the different content areas. So history, social studies. If you go into higher ed, it might be chemistry or things like that. So this is a whole continuum that we look at when we're talking about literacy. Now, because we're talking about young children, in which we're saying this is where it first begins, most of the focus in this presentation will be on this emergent literacy stage. And so I'm going to go into a little bit more depth with you about what do we mean when we're talking about emergent literacy. All right, so think about it. Emergent literacy begins at birth. All right, this has been highly researched, and some people say, well, what do you mean that it starts at birth? Actually, when we look at all of the supporting research, the process begins at birth, but the actual hearing that the child, which leads to literacy, begins at about 9 weeks of when the in utero. So this is why it's so important when we talk to moms and dads that we talk about, okay, you need to start reading to your child from birth, from the time that they are born, okay? Let me explain a little bit why this happens. At about nine weeks in utero, the baby's auditory system is already beginning to develop. So the little baby can already hear what's going on in the mom's tummy. They can hear what's going on in the mom's body, the environment. That's at 9 weeks in utero. So what we know is that it is extremely important from the time we know that we're pregnant to already begin talking to baby, exposing the baby to sounds and things like that, because we want them to have this wealth of auditory experience built up. The research shows us that by the time the baby is born, the baby already recognizes mom's voice. And, you know, when you think about it, it makes a whole lot of sense because the mom cannot separate from the baby. And so the baby is 24/7 constantly being exposed to mom's voice. So once the baby is born, then what we want to do is give them that opportunity and experience to hear language, hear sounds all the time. And when we're thinking about how does that then link to emergent literacy, well, let's think about it. When we are developing our ability to communicate, it starts off by our first looking at mom, looking at the caregiver, looking at whoever is feeding the baby or interacting or playing with the baby. And that is just what we call that joint attention, that we're looking at each other, we're exchanging things, we're referencing things together. All of that is being built up and will prepare the child to become a reader later on. As they begin to learn how to use their sounds, they're making noises, they're babbling, they're making all kinds of sounds, those will eventually lead to words. As we continue to develop, and at about 12 months of age, those sounds that the baby is making turns into real words. And now we're starting to hear the child use words like mama, dada, just all of those beginning words. As the baby begins to get older, those words begin to expand. And now we're talking about growth of vocabulary. So they're starting to use lots and lots of words. So, you know, eventually they're stringing the words together to say like baby eat or more cookie or sit down. So they're combining words. And that is the stage that one goes through to begin to use sentences. So they're combining all those words into sentences. So rather than saying more cookie, we hear the child saying, I want more cookie, or help me, please, or things like, I don't want that anymore, or go away. So they're combining the words together to send messages to each other. Eventually, as the child gets a little bit older, they're starting to tell us stories. And so they are talking about what happened during their day, something funny that happened, something sad that happened, or they were hurt. So those are called narratives. So they're starting to tell you about things that happened in their immediate experience. So we're not talking about things that happened yesterday or that are going to happen tomorrow. For the very young child, they're just able to talk about what's happening immediately. And that is a developmental milestone that we hope the child can achieve, whether they do it verbally or if they're using some other method of communication like sign language or some other mode of communication. We want the child to go through all of these stages where they get to the point where they can talk to you about things that happened immediately. Then it moves on to now we have a conversation. And that's why I wanted you to think about a conversation that you had with a communication partner, because it's this whole back and forth. It's like, I say something, you respond, you say something else, I respond. It's kind of like a tennis match where you're just going back and forth, back and forth. And that's the conversation that we want children to develop. So those are very critical milestones that children have to reach in order to become an emergent reader. All right. Now think about this. No one ever has to teach a child how to go through these stages. Right? When you think back, I bet that you cannot remember anybody having to teach you how to talk or use different words. It just happens. All right. So language just happens. When we then start to become readers, you have to think about, well, with reading, somebody has to teach us how to read. It's not an automatic thing. So what we want to do is make sure that children have a strong foundation of language, because that is upon which we can build the ability to learn how to read. All right. So when we are talking about emergent readers can be all ages. So it can be a very young child. So typically it's at about 3 years of age when children are beginning to use their language a lot more, and they're beginning to use books and recognize print. We could have somebody who's 16 years old who is still at an emergent reading stage. And so what I intend to do is try to help you understand what is it that we need to explicitly and very systematically teach a child to do, so that they can learn to read and they can be on that path in which they become readers and writers. All right. So we know I went through it pretty quickly, those developmental stages of language. So if a child is not talking yet or is not using a whole lot of words, that's why it's really critical for us to build up their language. And you have your teachers, you have your speech language pathologists, parents, everybody working on getting that language going, because that is so critical in learning how to read. So what you see on the screen right now is what we call the reading lobe. And the reason I have this reading lobe up on the screen is because when we are developing our reading skills. These are the two areas that need to be developed. One needs to have language comprehension, which is on the top of the road, and one needs to have word recognition skills. Language comprehension are all those things that are built into language. Background knowledge. I have to have experiences. So if I'm a young child, experiences going out on the playground, being outside, interacting with peers, playing with toys, playing on playground equipment, all those activities that I'm involved in will help me then be able to communicate with others about things that are happening in my immediate life. And when I then read books, I can relate those experiences to what I'm reading in a book. We have to have vocabulary knowledge. So that's why we want to have the child exposed to lots of different words, and not just knowing a lot of different words, but knowing how words go together. Like if I talk about clothing, what do I mean about clothing? Well, it can be a t-shirt, it can be a blouse, it can be shorts, it can be jeans, it can be long pants. Clothing falls into a category, and that's what we want children to know. So it's not just about knowing a lot of words, but knowing how they come together in categories, and then knowing how they're related to one another. Like, well, why is it that we can talk about shirts and pants and jeans, and why does that belong in that clothing category? We also need to know, the child needs to know that words can have different meanings. So when I talk about feet, I'm talking about that thing that's on the bottom of my leg, or it might be a way to measure things. So I need to know that words have different meanings. And when do I use the word feet for a part of my body versus feet as a way to measure things? So vocabulary has many different aspects. So what's important, the point I'm trying to get across is that vocabulary doesn't just talk about different words or knowing a lot of words. It's knowing how words are related, how we use words, how the meanings can change. On another point, we also need to know that about language structures. And when we are talking about English language, this means that how do we put the words in a specific order so that it has meaning? So I can say, I am going to the store, and I know that English, I cannot say store, I am going. It makes no sense. So language does have structure, and there's rules that we have to follow. Another thing when we talk about language structure is that there are little sounds that change the meaning of words. So if I add the sound at the end of the word, that can mean like it's plural. So I can talk about cookie, and that's one cookie. But when I say cookies, then we automatically know, if we're English language speakers, that we're talking about more than one cookie because of adding that S. Again, that is a structure that is a part of our English language. Now, of course, if I speak another language, they have different rules. But in this situation, I'm talking about the English structure. So in order for me to understand language, I have to know language structure. I also have to know that verbal reasoning. I have to know if I don't use a whole lot of words, I can infer what's meant by something. So especially when I'm reading, if I say that boy was big and tall and he couldn't fit his clothing, then I'm kind of inferring that, gosh, maybe he grew, or there's a reason why he can't fit his clothing anymore. So I'm making some inferences without having a whole lot of words spoken, but that kind of goes back to our background knowledge. So I have to have that experience of wearing clothing, growing clothing because I'm big and tall and now it doesn't fit anymore. So that's what's meant by verbal reasoning. And literacy knowledge talks about whether or not I understand that when I hold a book, I turn pages and I know which way to hold the book, whether it's the back or the front. I have to know that um, the print that I see on the page carries meaning. All right. All of that falls under language comprehension. So that those are strategies that I need to have in place in order to begin myself on this journey towards reading. But understanding all of that is not the only skill that I have. On the bottom of this rope, we have what's called word recognition. And that is what we typically know of as being able to decode see all those squiggles on a page and understand that that turns into a word. And those words now, when you put them all together, become sentences. And when I put those sentences together, now I can read a whole passage or a paragraph. That's on that word recognition side. So these are the skills that are very, very important for children to be taught. These are the skills that are taught to children very explicitly when they're in kindergarten. So you hear teachers talking about, well, what sound do we hear? Let's listen for that sound. And that's the sound that we make when we put our lips together and we say, Now let's write it. Let's see what it looks like. And this is now called the letter M. So when we have those skills in place, now I can start on that journey to become a reader. So phonological awareness is, as I was describing earlier, it's when I'm listening for those speech sounds. Those are all the things. It's a listening skill, which is why we want the children to have good listening abilities. Because when we start reading, we want them to be able to pay attention to all those speech sounds. That's called phonological awareness. At a very, very discrete level, it's called phoneme awareness. So we have to have those listening skills in place. Then we move into decoding, and that's looking at what's on the page and saying, okay, when I see that squiggly line that looks like the letter M, I know that it can make this sound. And if I were to combine all those letters together, ah, it spells mom. All right, so that's decoding, where I'm looking at what's written on the page. I know what the sounds that those letters make. I can push them all together and I can now read the word mom. Okay. Sight recognition is when you can look at something very quickly and you automatically know that that word says mom. So you don't have to go through the process of saying, that first letter is the second letter is the third letter is now I'm putting it together. It says mom. You don't have to do that. Sight recognition means that I can just look at it really quickly and it says mom. And it's forever in my brain that when I see those three letters together, it says mom. Okay, so these are all, when you see it on this reading rope, when you see the strands of this braid, they're all separate like this, because all the skills begin to develop. After a while, especially when for the very young child, these strands start to kind of braid together. They're integrating together. So as I told you, the child learns words and then they learn sentences and things like that. They're learning the words, they're learning the language structure. Everything's starting to braid together. All right. And their language is really starting to develop. Word recognition, this is what's being taught when they're in about kindergarten. So those skills all have to be taught and they're starting to braid together. Once a child gets up to about second and third grade, their skills are starting to come together and they're starting to braid together in a rope. So if you think about a rope, if you braid it together very loosely, it's not going to be a very strong rope. And when we think about reading, we can think about it the same way. This is when the child is just learning how to read. They're still kind of struggling through, I have to sound out those words and I'm going to have to relate it to my own personal experiences and things like that. They're still learning this. When we get to that point where we're reading to learn, now we want to get the children to this part of the rope where the rope is very, very tightly wound together. And now I'm fluent at my reading. I can read all of those words. I'm going to relate it to what I read, to my own personal experiences. I'm making inferences. This is what we want. This is the end goal for all of our children so that they can become skilled readers. Now, it doesn't happen automatically. They cannot become skilled readers if we don't address both parts of the rope. All right. And if we don't put a whole lot of emphasis on building their language skills, a child may come into that time in their reading instruction where their language skills might be kind of weak. And we're talking about teaching them word recognition. They will never become a skilled reader if we don't have both of these skill sets very strong and woven together. So what we want to do, parents, educators, speech language pathologists, anybody who is working with a child, we want them to really become strong in their emergent literacy stage. So what do they need to learn? They need to learn why we need to read. And for very young children, we need to help them build joy in when we open a book. This is going to be lots of fun. This is going to be exciting. This is a time when we can snuggle together and we can learn to read. We want them to build up their background knowledge so they can relate all of their experiences to what's going on in a book. We want them to understand the concepts about print. So what that means is when we're looking at a book, we want them to know that the print on the page has meaning, that it means something. So this is not about just knowing how to write your alphabets or how to recite your alphabets. This is about having the children understand that print has meaning. And when we read, it will give us that meaning and it'll give us the joy. We want them to be able to understand phonemic awareness, that each sound can bring meaning to a word. We want them to be able to identify concrete words. We want them to identify some letter meanings and sounds. This is all at that emergent literacy stage, and develop a desire to learn how to read. So how do we go about doing that? We want, as I said, said earlier, we want everyone to promote growth in emergent readers. And that means that we're always pointing out to the children what print means and how it can add to our lives. So when I talk about everyone can promote growth, I'm talking about whether you're a bus driver, and so when the children get onto the bus and they're saying, oh, we have to stop at the stop sign because that says stop. That's already promoting emergent reading because we're helping the children understand that that print has meaning. It tells us to stop. A mom or a dad, when they're sitting with the child, can promote literacy skills or emergent reading by reading with their children. So one of the techniques that you use as speech language pathologists is what we call shared reading. Shared reading is an excellent approach that can be used to build language so that the children have those language skills, which will push them into that world of reading and writing. And shared reading is, just as you see on the screen here, it's that interaction that occurs between an adult and a child as they read a book together. And when I'm talking about this, it's not just reading the book to just get through the pages, right? This is about how we engage in a conversation with a child as we're sharing the books together. It's reading with a child, not reading to a child, but reading with a child and having this interaction where we're conversing about what we're seeing on page. So really, it's about a conversation that the child and the adult are having about text, all right? And when I talk about this for somebody who is 3 years old, 13 years old, or 60 years old, if they're still at that emergent literacy stage, shared reading is the approach that we would use to kind of get them immersed in literacy. So let's talk a little bit about why we're using shared reading. And the research tells us that shared reading really enhances literacy skills. If we want our children to become literate to the best of their potential, we should use shared reading experiences. So now we're going to talk about what is a shared reading experience. And an easy way to kind of remember this concept is to think about the acronym CAR. All right. So when I say follow the CAR, when we are reading with a child, we want the adult to follow the child's lead by following the CAR. So they might pick up a book and comment about a picture, and then they're going to wait for the child to respond. So they're going to comment about the picture. They're going to wait for the child to respond in whatever way they can. And for some children, they might be saying, let's say I'm reading about dinosaurs. I'm going to say, oh, look, we're going to read a book about dinosaurs. And then I'm going to wait. And by waiting, I am giving that child the time to respond. So whether they're going to look at the picture, whether they're going to point to the picture of the dinosaur, whether they're going to say dino or dinosaur, or I saw a dinosaur, however they are going to respond, what we want to do is wait. Right? And that can be, for many folks, one of the hardest things to do, because what we're asking is that you comment about the picture and then you sit back and wait. And waiting means counting probably to about 10 very slowly. So I might have a book and I'm going to say, oh, look, we have a dinosaur. I wonder what this book is going to be about. Now I want to wait. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to count in my head to 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The reason we want to wait and count is because some children have difficulty with that processing of information. So they need time to hear what you say and then figure out, well, how am I going to respond? Or what should I say? whether I point, whether I nod, whether I look at the picture, or whether I say something. So we have to give them wait time. And I know it's really hard because when we try it in the field, people that I train with always tell me that is the hardest thing. So that's why I want you to count to 10. All right. So we wait. And if after 10, we don't hear any response from the child, or we don't see the child looking, or the child is looking away or not responding, that's when I might come back and say, oh, can we point? So you as the parent or the person who knows this child well knows the best way that this child can respond. So you might say, oh, let's point to the dinosaur, or let's look at the dinosaur, or let's hold the dinosaur. You could even have a dinosaur that matches the picture that you're going to hold and ask them to participate. You're going to ask them to participate. So you're asking them, oh, let's point to the dinosaur, or let's look at the dinosaur, or let's hold the dinosaur. And again, we're going to wait. Right? So we're going to wait, and the waiting again is counting to 10, because for the child who does not participate, I need to give them time to think about how they're going to respond, or if I'm doing it hand or over hand, giving that time to understand, hear the message, respond with some support, and wait again. All right? Based on how the child responds, then I'm going to add a little bit more. So I'm going to say something like, yes, the dinosaur is very big, or the dinosaur looks kind of mean and he's growling. I wonder what that's all about. Okay, so I'm responding by adding a little bit more. So what I'm hoping that you're seeing with this is by using the car, commenting, waiting for a response, having the child participate by responding, and then waiting again. And then my response, by adding a little bit more, is really more of a conversation. It's that turn taking. Notice I am not asking the child, oh, what color is the dinosaur? Or, gee, show me the sun. Or what color is the cloud? All right. By asking those kinds of questions or infusing those kinds of comments into our reading really kind of takes away from the interest in how it should be joyful, because now it's almost becoming a test for the child. You're kind of testing the child to see what they know or don't know, and it's almost like becoming a drill. Shared reading is all about having a conversation, having a joyful conversation about reading with the child. And what we want to do is we want to have interactions with every single page. So you want to pause on the page, interact with the child, have fun with that page. And if the child does not want to turn the page, then we stay on that page. If the child wants to flip the pages and go through, we follow their lead and we let them flip through it. So here's the question that I get a lot is like, oh my gosh, my child wants to read the same story every night over and over and over. And that's a good thing. That is an absolutely good thing, because the more the child becomes familiar with the book, the more they'll be able to talk about it, relate their experiences to the story, and converse and build up all those language skills, use different words, use different sentence structures and things like that. A child who is not very interested in reading, I might do 1 page a night or 1 page a day. That's all it takes. I'm trying to build that interaction with the child so that we can begin to love reading and love the books. All right. So you follow your child's lead, however long it takes, however quickly they want to go through, however many times they want to go through the book. But what we want to do is build language page by page. So what you see in this illustration is, here's a mom, and you see I purposely selected this picture because, as you can see, she has emergent readers at all ages. So she's got the baby in the middle, and then she has probably like a little 2-year-old who's the boy, and maybe a 4-year-old who's the girl. So our emergent readers can be of all ages, they can be at different stages, but look at how the children are engaged. They're looking at the book, they're talking about it. Mom is saying, I see a cow. And so now we're trying to see, well, how is each one of these children responding to mom's comment about, I see a cow? So she's commenting, she's going to wait for each one of them to respond. Or if we're in a group and we have 3 children that we're reading to at once, I might be waiting for one child to respond, but we'll give the other child another opportunity, say if we move to another page. Mom wants to talk about what's going on in the book. So, oh, the cow is making a big mess. So adding a lot of inflection in there, using her voice, making it loud, making it soft, making it sound exciting. But the cow is making a big mess. All right. So now, again, she makes a comment. She's going to wait. And remember, we're waiting by counting to 10 and see which one of the children in this little group here is going to respond, and how are they going to respond. All right. So waiting for the response. Look what she's doing next, connecting it to real life by saying, oh, sometimes we make messes too. These are not the words in the book, but remember background knowledge? Now I want to connect it to what happens in our everyday lives. And we might have somebody say, yeah, I made a mess when I spilled my milk. Or somebody else might be saying, messy. Or somebody else might be saying, ugh. We want to respond to the child however they are responding, but connecting it to that concept of mess in their own personal experiences. So in the book, the cows made a mess. Now let's talk about a mess that we made in real life. Okay, connecting to background knowledge, allowing this conversation to happen during shared reading. It makes it a lot of fun. It makes it meaningful for the children, all right? The other thing that we want to do, remember, we want to have literacy knowledge. That was in that strand when we talked about having literacy knowledge. And for young children, this means referencing the print. So you want to select books that have some nice fonts in there. They might have this C that's written really funny. And so what she's saying is, oh, look, here's a C. And C is in your name. Your name is Carter. I hear that sound. That's the sound that this letter makes. So we want to make sure that we talk about the sound, which is K. And the letter has a name, and its name is C. So that's why she says, there's a C like the C in your name. This is taking quite a while because we are spending a lot of time on just this one page. So there is no reason that we need to finish a book just at one sitting. We can finish a page, we can finish a few pages. When the children are losing interest, we can stop, but we can address many issues about literacy just through a shared book reading activity. All right. The goal in the shared reading is for interaction. What we're trying to build is we're trying to build up their language, and we want to put meaning to all communication attempts. So whether a child is verbal, is nonverbal, they're showing us how they are communicating. So whether they point, whether they just make a sound, whether they just look at the book, shared reading gives us that opportunity to put meaning to all of their communication attempts. We want the children to reference the book and look at the book as mom or dad is reading. And the reason this is important is because as children get older, and when they're just reading text without any pictures, and sometimes we tell them, well, go back and where did you find that information? We, at this very early stage, we want the children to be able to reference the print and begin to get this understanding that print has meaning. And this is how we do it. We're pointing to the words, and we're also having them relate it to the pictures. Just kind of on a side note, what we know in the research is that whether you're an adult or whether you're a child, if you are looking at a book that has pictures, your eyes will automatically go to the pictures first rather than the text. And so because of that, because of just that automatically going to the picture rather than the print, for children who struggle with reading, we want them to understand that print has meaning. So we want to direct their eyes to the print. And that's why we ask parents to make sure that they use their fingers to show the child that I'm following the print, because their eyes will automatically go to the pictures. We want to redirect them to the print. So I'll always use your fingers as you're pointing to the print on the page, okay? Shared reading, we also want to make sure that we provide the wait time. Because this is hard to do, you want to practice. You want to practice waiting and follow the child's lead. So if the child is getting a little bit antsy, then we redirect by asking them to participate. Right? So give them that wait time, so that they have the time to respond. But if they're responding very quickly, you follow their lead, but ask them to participate. Because if you have a child who looks away, then you say, well, let's look back here at the book and let's talk about the dinosaur, or let's go get a dinosaur that looks like this one in the book. Okay? We want to also make sure that when we are involved in shared reading, that we use our voice output, any kind of device. If your child is using a device or symbols, that we use those symbols and we help them understand that this is their way of participating in the shared reading. So we ask them to point on their device as they're giving responses, or show us, give us a card which shows us that they are participating. So using alternative means of sharing in this shared book reading, but always giving them those opportunities to participate in a shared reading. And remember that the shared reading experience is to build up the language and that social interaction, that communication interaction, use it as an opportunity to build up vocabulary, sentence structures. Storybooks are great because the vocabulary level, the language structure level is always above the child's reading level. So it's a great way to expose children to higher levels of comprehension. It's a great way to hone in on a child's interest level. So if a child is very interested in cars, and let's say they are in the 7th grade, but at the emergent literacy level, then I'm going to get magazines about cars, and we're going to talk about the cars and maybe read passages about the cars. So the point here about shared reading is that remember that an emergent literacy, a person who is at that emergent literacy stage can be at any age. They can be a very young child, they can be a teen, they can be an adult who is at emergent literacy. Shared reading is a way that we can begin to introduce literacy skills to children at a level that is appropriate for them, and yet at a level in which their interest is, we can build upon their interest. And we're asking them to participate in a conversation with us as we are building their literacy skills. Okay, that is the end of this presentation. And what I'd like to encourage you to do is view this video several times, practice your shared reading with your children, and enjoy, and happy reading to you all.